Welcome to Brain Ponderings, your window into brain research. I'm Mark Mattson. My guest today is Professor Richard Davidson. He's Richie Davidson. He's a professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also, I guess, founder and head of the Center for Healthy Minds there. He can talk about that later. And he's done a lot of early work on trying to understand anxiety, depression, and what's going on in the brain. But then he got interested at some point in what's going on good in the brain in people who are happy and satisfied and have a fulfilled life. And that's what he's going to talk with us about today. Welcome, Richie.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
And you've got a little bit of a Brooklyn accent still, I think. You grew up in Brooklyn?
I did. Yes, I did. Spent my first chapter in Brooklyn, New York.
And can you kind of quickly go through your career and when did you get first interested in the human brain and how it works?
I would say really pretty early on, even in high school, I started doing some volunteer work at a local hospital where they had a sleep laboratory. And the idea that you can actually record physiology from a person and then wake them up in the middle of the night and find out that there's mental content that was somehow correlated with the physiology was kind of remarkable to me. And those are some early sort of insights that really have stayed with me. And I knew that my life somehow would be associated with the mind. Exactly what form it would take, I wasn't sure. But, it became quickly apparent that one way to study the mind was through the brain. And that led me to psychology and neuroscience.
And so you got introduced to EEG recording then from the brain there, and then you started to use that quite a bit in your early research, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I first began, there was no neuroimaging. I was a graduate student in the 1970s, and the only method we really had to non-invasively study the human brain was EEG.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were really the early days.
And I went back and scanned through some of your publications from back then. So spent a lot of time looking at kind of left brain, right brain, like differences in, I guess, EEG in different settings. Is that?
Yeah, so we got quite interested in asymmetries in activation in different regions, different cortical regions that may be associated with different attributes of emotion. And that work was based on some findings with individuals with localized brain damage, where one of the key findings was that patients with damage in their left frontal region were more likely to show what has been called in the clinical neurology literature a catastrophic depressive reaction to their brain injury, whereas patients with comparable damage in the right prefrontal region had a very different, more indifferent, and also occasionally inappropriate euphoria. And those were observations that had been reported. Was a guy by the name of Bob Robinson, who was a psychiatrist at Hopkins at the time, and he was doing some of that work on depressive reactions in brain lesion patients. And that was one of the early motivations for the research on asymmetries in the normal human brain. We were really the first to begin to look at this in an intact human. And again, the only methods that we had available in those days were EEG methods. And so we began to look at that. And one of the things that we noticed is that there are individual differences in the relative activation of the left and right prefrontal region that can be recorded from EEG. And those variations among people are actually reliable. They're stable over time. So if you look at the test-retest reliability of this metric of asymmetric activation, we were, seeing test-retest reliability in the 0.7 range, which is modestly stable over a 6-month period. And furthermore, when we sampled a large population, and you look at this metric, it was normally distributed. And so it met the kind of characteristics for a trait-like feature. And then, of course, we began to explore what the behavioral correlates of this might be. And there we found indeed that there were differences in the emotional dispositions of these people, so that people with greater baseline left prefrontal activation had more positive affect. They had a more optimistic kind of emotional style. We talked about them as being more approach oriented, a kind of active, positive affect.
And then, but did that get you interested at that point yet in things like meditation, or was it your experience meeting the Dalai Lama that did that?
Well, I had been interested in meditation from early on. In fact, after my second year of graduate school, I went off to India to get an experiential taste of meditation myself. And I came back, really excited about the possibility of doing research on it. But it was very clear that the zeitgeist was not ready for it, and I was actively discouraged by my professors in graduate school. I actually dabbled in it. I published a couple of papers when I was a graduate student on meditation research, but then dropped it for 20 years. And that was until I met the Dalai Lama, who basically encouraged me to take it seriously and begin investigating it. And that's really when things began to change.
I remember that time. So I did my PhD work at the University of Iowa, and actually did some meditation there. But the negative thing, and you know this maybe more, but I think it was in Iowa, there was a center where they claimed that people could levitate, right?
Yeah,
Remember
these were folks in, I think it's Fairfield, Iowa, where the Maharishi International University is. This was the TM people. And from my perspective, the TM people were they made it very challenging for people like me, because they were, just I would say blindly faithful to their tradition. They really, I think, were not doing great science, and I was quite skeptical of many of the claims that they were making. And some of the papers in the meditation area that I'm most proud of from our lab are papers where we hypothesized that meditation would be good for something, and it turns out it wasn't. And we have we've been very committed to publishing non-findings. And I think we now have 8 papers. And the most recent one was a very high-profile paper published in Science Advances showing that a standard 2-month course in mindfulness meditation that's been very well studied, mindfulness-based stress reduction, does not produce structural changes in the brain, despite all the hype that it does. And we, published the largest and most rigorously conducted study of its kind, and we found nothing. And we really felt strongly that we needed to publish that. And it doesn't diminish my interest in meditation, nor my view that it's valuable, but I think we just need to be honest and truthful about what it does and what it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So in general, it can have relatively, I guess you would say, subtle but real and important effects. Can you first give some definitions of, there's different kinds of meditation, correct?
Yeah, I often say that meditation is like sports. There are, hundreds of different kinds of meditation practices, and they likely do different things to the brain. And the scientific research has only focused on a few of them. And so there's still many kinds of meditation which are part of the classical contemplative traditions that have not been studied scientifically.
So these, when I was at Iowa, I just did kind of the old thing where they give you this mantra, right? And then you keep repeating it and repeating it. So my experience was I was very relaxed at the end of the session, but then, I go back to the stress of, working on PhD and, so it seemed that for me, it seemed to have a beneficial effect in the short term, but I didn't really notice any obvious, this is anecdotal, of course, but so how do you study, what methods do you use to study meditation? You have subjects who've never meditated, you have them meditate, and then you look at some endpoint, you take people who have meditated a long time, compare them to those that haven't.
All of the above, all of the above. So, going back to the first issue that you raised about the transient nature of the effects that you experienced, that's a critically important issue. And a number of years ago, I wrote a book with Dan Goleman called Altered Traits. And the title of the book is a play on altered states. And we call it Altered Traits because the aspiration with meditation is that it really affect every nook and cranny of your everyday life. That's really why people meditate, at least according to the classical kind of traditions. We don't meditate for the experience that we get while we're meditating. It's not like a drug. It's not a high. That's not why, according to the classical traditions, that's not why you meditate. You meditate to become a better person, to be more kind, to be more compassionate, to be more present in your everyday life.
Yeah.
That's why you meditate. And so if it's not having those effects, well, then you're probably wasting your time, to be blunt. So one of the ways to study meditation is you can train people, you can have people meditate and then look at their behavior and other aspects of their biology outside of meditation when they're not meditating. And that's a way to look at more enduring effects. And those are the effects we really care about.
Yeah. And the mindfulness, so the idea with mindfulness is you practice this, get good at it, and then throughout the day you can be in this more of a mindfulness state. Is that
Yes, with mindfulness, that's one way to put it. So the way mindfulness has been most often defined in the research tradition on this kind of meditation is that mindfulness is being uh, uh, present non-judgmentally. And so that's the core of it. And when we test for the effects of mindfulness, we will often look at the impact that this kind of training has on one's capacity to attend in in everyday life kinds of circumstances outside of formal meditation. And so yeah, there are literally hundreds of studies looking at the effects of mindfulness meditation on different aspects of attention in non-meditating contexts.
Yeah, and so you start out doing EEG recording, but what do you see? What's kind of your main findings looking at neural network activity? While someone's engaged in meditation or kind of long-term effects.
Yeah, well, when we were able to begin using functional MRI and other kinds of MRI, then, things really opened up in terms of our ability to look at brain networks with a little bit more precision. And what we see in mindfulness meditation is essentially the most important differences, and the ones that I think have been most systematically replicated, are functional changes in connectivity among different networks. And the three key networks involved that have been studied in the neuroscience, in the human neuroscience literature, are these. One is the default mode, and I can talk about each of these after. One is the default mode. The other is what neuroscientists have called the salience network. And the third is what's been called the central executive network. Those three networks are the three really key networks in understanding the effects of mindfulness meditation. And so, to unpack that now, the default mode is a network of brain activity that really was first discovered in some classical experiments at WashU by Mark Rakel and his colleagues. And the default mode is a mode of brain activity that is present when we're not doing other cognitively demanding activities. And so if you put a person in a scanner and you give them the ridiculously ambiguous instruction to simply please rest, what do people do? Well, their minds wander. And what kind of mind wandering do they do? Well, it's mostly self-referential mind wandering, because for most people, the most important thing that they're concerned about is themselves. And so they have a lot of self-referential thought. And when you have that, it turns out that your default mode is active. And the default mode consists primarily of midline structures, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. Those are the two sort of big areas of the default mode. And most people, when they're engaged in this kind of self-referential thought, are not particularly happy. They are distracted by this kind of, it's almost like a kind of rumination. So what you see with mindfulness meditation is a change in connectivity between the default mode and other networks. And what you particularly see is a strengthening of the connection between the default mode and the central executive network. And basically, one way to think about this is that the central executive network is modulating the activity in the default mode. It's basically keeping it in check. And the salience network is involved because in the untrained brain, the default mode will tend to recruit the salience network because people get all worked up about self-referential activity. They think it's important. And the salience network gets involved. But when I mentioned before this piece about mindfulness being non-judgmental, the non-judgmental aspect is associated with really a decrease in the extent to which the salience network gets activated. Because you learn to regard these thoughts as no different than any other thoughts, basically.
Yeah.
And that results in a change in connectivity with the salience network. So there's a dynamic interplay between the default mode, the central executive network, and the salience network. And it's the alteration in that connectivity, which I think is probably the most replicated set of findings in the area of mindfulness meditation.
Yeah, that's very intriguing. That, my understanding the default mode network is that it, you sit with your eyes closed and there's not much input from the outside, and so the default mode network is pretty active. And then when you engage with the environment, whether you're reading, talking to somebody, whatever, activity in the default mode network goes down, and activity in brain regions involved in the processing of what you're doing goes up. Is that?
Yes,
Yeah.
that is correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mentioned about this transient for me. I didn't persist very long with the meditation. One thing I've found that I think pretty much anybody finds has pretty consistent benefits on their mental health is physical exercise. So you exercise for 30 minutes or an hour a day, and then you feel good the rest of the day, and you keep doing that, and that can improve your mental health. It's actually a good antidepressant thing. And we know actually some of the things that are going on in the brain. There's increased levels of this neurotrophic factor, BDNF, and probably some neuroplasticity going on. And one thing you've been very interested in is neuroplasticity. Now, you mentioned the kind of negative study where I'm assuming you're doing structural MRI, where you're looking at kind of the amount of gray matter in a certain brain region. But there can be more subtle changes in structure that can affect, these functional
Absolutely.
going on. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're pointing to something really interesting and exciting. And I think it's probably the case that, I mean, you know more about this than I do, but I would say that today, if we were to say what's the most empirically well-validated strategy, non-pharmacological strategy for increasing neuroplasticity, I think the data would suggest that it's aerobic exercise.
Yes, that's right.
Um, so my to give a sort of novel twist to this, so I think we agree on that. And to give a novel twist to this, what I often say is that neuroplasticity in and of itself is neutral. If you are increasing your neuroplasticity and your mind is filled with toxic thoughts, or
Yeah.
you're in a toxic environment, it will actually facilitate the consolidation of that kind of input,
Yeah.
and will actually have a deleterious outcome.
That
Um,
goes back to related to your early work on anxiety and, fear. You're right. There's plasticity in amygdala or whatever in a way that it's not good for your
Exactly,
well-being.
exactly. We know that trauma, for example, affects the brain. There's very good evidence for that. And those are deleterious consequences. We also know that SSRIs, one of their functions, and some people believe that this is their key mechanism, is that they're neuroplasticity enhancers. And there's evidence to show that SSRIs actually stimulate neurogenesis in the hippocampus.
Yeah.
Um, so um, if you look at trials, clinical trials with SSRIs, you will always see that there's a portion. It's typically a small portion, but nevertheless, some people who, when they take SSRIs, actually get worse. And
Interesting.
again, if they're in a toxic environment and you're increasing neuroplasticity, that may make things worse. And so one of the implications of this line of thought is that what if we pair uh, uh, an exercise-induced neuroplasticity, for example, with meditation, so that your mind is filled with wholesome thoughts, if you will, and you are stimulating neuroplasticity using this, tried and true method that the science really shows is effective.
Yeah.
And this is something that hardly has been studied. And when you think of the average American gym, it probably has changed since COVID, but a gym where people are working out, doing aerobic exercise, and watching all this gunk on television,
Yeah.
it's a prescription for disaster.
Richie, I've been interested. It's very important to think of all this from an evolutionary perspective. And, we evolved hunter-gatherers, right? We're out in the environment every day, right? There's not all this crazy input we're getting second by second, which is, as everyone knows, accelerated tremendously in the last decades. And so, you know, we we didn't evolve in environments where this was a normal thing, as in exercising in a gym with so people nowadays don't take time to think critically. I think people are reading books less, and I know the young people are, and they're
Absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And when, in the hunter-gatherer days, when you're doing physical exercise outdoors in the course of, hunting and gathering, you're out in nature.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, that's for me personally, nature gives me the most pleasure of anything. Maybe even more than in some sense, social interactions. It's just kind of the way I'm geared. I grew up on a farm and kind of that environment had kind of a small social network. So I guess for me, it's kind of a developmental thing that's persisted where I feel most comfortable and happy when I've got a nice garden going now. And, that gives me most pleasure. And right. So one very important aspect of what you're doing is a practical approach, right? And this, your Center for Healthy Minds, and people can go to your website and see that. Just put in Center for Healthy Minds and Davidson or whatever, and you'll find it easily. Is that you are showing and developing methods essentially for people to essentially train their minds in beneficial ways that improve their well-being. Can you talk about that? You have this kind of four pillars of a healthy mind.
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, we developed a framework that the title of the paper presenting the framework was the plasticity of well-being. And its subtitle is a training-based framework for the cultivation of human flourishing. And what we wanted to do is to identify the necessary and sufficient elements that were present in both modern scientific research as well as in the contemplative traditions. What does it take to really promote human flourishing? What are the key ingredients? And we came up with four. And two of these are found in most other frameworks for understanding well-being. And two of them are totally unique. They're not in any other Western scientific framework for understanding well-being. And so the four of these, the first is awareness. And awareness is not in any other framework. Awareness is where we would put mindfulness. And it includes a capacity that psychologists and neuroscientists call meta-awareness. And meta-awareness is the capacity to know what our minds are doing. And many people may find that strange. Don't we always know what our minds are doing? But I'm sure that many listeners will recognize the following example. When you might be reading a book where you're reading each word on a page, and you read one page, you might read a second page, and after a few minutes, you have absolutely no idea what you've just read. Your mind is somewhere else. That's an example of not knowing what our mind is doing. But the moment we recognize that, it's a moment of awakening and a moment of meta-awareness. And it turns out that research shows that that can be trained. And training in that produces all kinds of benefits. And there was a very famous paper published in Science in 2010, many years ago. It was done by a group of psychologists at Harvard. And what they did is this was in a sample of about 2,500 people. And with their permission, they texted them at different points during the day, and they asked them three questions. One question is, what are you doing right now? And they checked off from a list of activities what they were doing. Second question is, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question they asked is, how happy or unhappy are you right at this moment? And you used the slider to indicate. So that was the experiment. And what they found is that the average adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing, 47% of the time. And when they reported that they were not paying attention to what they were doing, they were significantly less happy, even if what they were doing was boring, even if what they were doing was like washing the dishes. If your mind was distracted, you were less happy. And the title of this paper in Science is "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind."
Interesting. Yeah.
So that's the first pillar of well-being, awareness. Second pillar of well-being is connection. And connection is about qualities that are important for healthy social relationships, qualities like appreciation and gratitude and kindness and compassion. The Surgeon General of the United States, Vivek Murthy, in 2023 issued an urgent health advisory for the first time ever in US history. And it was a health advisory on loneliness and social isolation. And one of the things that he points out in that report and presents the data on this is that loneliness is actually a greater risk factor for premature mortality than is smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So loneliness gets under the skin and it affects our biology in ways that are consequential for health. And it turns out that these um, practices that can cultivate connection are really powerful antidotes to loneliness. So
And
that's,
with, you've done some work like measuring cortisol levels in, I think, in different people. And so are there data showing that people who are lonely have hyperactivation of the stress response? Are
yeah, there are some data to show that, but let me go through the other two
okay,
pillars, and
okay,
we can return to
okay.
considering the evidence. So the third pillar we call insight. And insight is a curiosity-driven self-knowledge. And it literally is an experiential understanding of the narrative that we all carry around in our minds. So, and this goes back to the default mode. We all carry around a narrative. This is what human minds and brains do. We all have a set of beliefs and expectations of ourselves.
Mhm.
And this literally determines our reality. It shapes how we perceive the world. And what's critical for well being is not so much changing the narrative, but it's changing our relationship to the narrative so that we can see the narrative for what it is, which is really a set of thoughts, it's a set of beliefs and expectations. And when we really understand that, it helps to loosen the grip that this narrative has. And we know that, there are people on one extreme end of a continuum who have a very negative self-narrative. They have negative beliefs about themselves. They have low expectations. And that's a prescription for depression. And what's really important, again, is not so much changing the narrative at the beginning, but changing our relationship to the narrative. And then finally, the last pillar is purpose. And purpose is about finding our sense of direction in life and clarifying our values. And it's not so much about finding something more purposeful to do with our lives, but how can we find meaning and purpose in that which we already do, including the pedestrian activities of daily living. So can taking out the garbage, can washing the dishes be deeply connected to your sense of purpose? And the answer is, of course, it could be. It
Yeah.
requires a little bit of reframing, and that's something that's easily learned. And so we have put these four pillars of well-being into a curriculum that we call the Healthy Minds program. We've released it as an app. It's totally free. It's freely available, and a nonprofit that we started associated with our university center is producing the app, has released it into the world. You can download it wherever you get apps. It's available on both iOS and Android. It's called the Healthy Minds Program. And the New York Times Wirecutter named it as one of the 3 best meditation apps for 3 years in a row. And it's the only one that's totally free and the only one that actually is evidence-based. We've published 2 randomized controlled trials on the app, and we have 2 others that are in process. So there's more scientific evidence for this app than any other meditation app out there.
Okay, I'll try that out and see how it goes.
Good, thank
Uh,
you.
okay, so in this attention and meta awareness pillar, um, it's interesting. When I used to work in the lab a lot, you have some method that you use all the time, and you get so good at it that you don't really seem to have to think about what you're doing. And but it was during those times that I did a lot of my good thinking, actually.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if that's similar to the notion, like when you're moving physically and thinking, like walking, right? It's well known, a lot of famous people have done a lot of their good thinking while they're walking, and there's a walking meditations, right? Um, so is what I'm saying something different than what you're saying with regards to attention? Because in that case, I'm not really paying attention to what I'm doing, my mind's kind of I guess it's not really wandering. I'm actually thinking.
Yeah, so what I would say is this, Mark. You can take a walk where you basically form the intention at the outset of the walk that I'm going to be walking, I'm walking in a safe place. I don't really have to do a lot of monitoring of my environment. And what I'm going to really be doing, my main task, is being mindful of my thoughts. And I'm going to use this period as an opportunity to really harness the creative potential of my thinking.
Yeah.
One of the things that I tell my graduate students and postdocs, and I've been telling this for years, is I'd like you to spend at least a few hours every week without any book, without any paper, simply paying attention to your thoughts. Just really pay attention to your thoughts. And you could have, a notepad where you jot down some thoughts as they occur, so you don't forget them, but keep paying attention to your thoughts. And that's all you should do. Most people don't do that. And our minds are associative networks. They're creating novel thoughts all the time. Everyone dreams every night. Most people don't remember their dreams. And it's the same is true with waking thoughts. Most people don't remember their thoughts because they're not paying attention to what's going on inside. And when we engage in a non-cognitively demanding activity like walking, we have the opportunity to pay more attention to our thoughts. People often report that they get an insight in the shower. Well, that's another example. There's nothing cognitively demanding taking a shower.
Right.
But you can also be even more intentional about it. You can sit down at your desk and say, I'm going to just pay attention to my thoughts for the next hour.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So so how do you come up with some scales to measure, if you have a person, you have a way to like semi-quantitatively rate them on,
Yeah, we have a validated self-report measure of each of the four pillars of well-being: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. It's published. We've done all the psychometrics on it. We've tested thousands of participants. And in our app, we present this scale and we give it to people to take every 28 days so that they can monitor their progress. So if you go on the app, you'll get the scale. Of course, you don't have to take it, but if you do take it, we provide that feedback to you. And it's a valid self-report scale. There are always limits to what you can infer with a self-report measure, but it's not any worse than any other self-report measure, and we think it's perhaps better because it includes distinctive pillars of well-being that are usually not measured. The two, by the way, that are the ones that are not found in other frameworks for understanding well-being are awareness and insight. The connection and purpose piece is found in every other scheme for understanding well-being.
Yeah. Now you mentioned, you're interested in looking at potential interactions between meditation, exercise. My lab, actually, we did all the early work on looking at how intermittent fasting affects health in the brain and in animal studies. And then we've been involved in some humans. We have one, hopefully it's going to get accepted soon, where we looked at effects of intermittent fasting on battery of psychological tests, mostly focused on cognition. We did structural and functional MRI. We have CSF and blood samples in people at risk for cognitive impairment because of their age and metabolic status.
Mm-hmm.
They're 55 to 70. with obesity and insulin resistance. And we found some beneficial effects of intermittent fasting in some cognitive domains. Um, you go back to the traditions of meditation. There's also fasting as a tradition, right? And I think Buddhist monks, what did they do in terms of, did they do periods of fasting, right?
Not really.
Not really?
Not really. Not in any systematic way. But their eating in the monastery is interesting. They have breakfast and lunch. They do not have dinner.
Okay,
Uh,
well that's something we call daily time restricted eating. And it's actually enough to cause a metabolic switch from glucose to ketones. And there's a lot that goes on with that metabolic switch.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, a monk in a monastery does not eat after 12 noon.
Yeah. Wow. So they're fasting for up to 18 hours a day or something like.
Yeah, I guess they have breakfast probably around 7 or 7:30 in the morning. So that would be their next meal.
Yeah. So even 19 hours. Yeah. Um, there's a huge research. I would encourage you to maybe think about incorporating some combination things or looking at.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I haven't really thought about it from that perspective, but that's super interesting.
When I retired from NIH, I finally had time to write a book.
Ah, okay, great. I'll have to get it.
Take a look and yeah. Um, and we got a lot into the animals and what's going on in their brains. It's pretty interesting. When the animals are adapted to intermittent fasting eating pattern, there's enhanced GABAergic tone
Hmm.
and maybe an increase in the gamma frequency
Really?
on EEG.
Because that's what we see in meditators,
Yeah.
the pronounced gamma oscillations.
And then again, going back to the evolutionary perspective, not only do humans evolve a lot of physical activity every day, but food scarcity is actually a major driver for evolution, probably even human brain evolution. All the early tools invented by humans, as far as we know, had to do with acquiring and processing food. So these kind of challenges that our ancestors normally faced, our genome is geared to so that our brains and bodies function well in that environment. And so if we don't nowadays subject ourselves to, if we're overeating and sedentary, we're not subjecting ourselves to those environmental challenges that our cells and organ systems are geared to respond in a beneficial way to.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting.
Yeah. We only have a few minutes left because I know you got to go. Uh,
Yeah.
what what is your most exciting work to you going on right now up there in Madison?
Well, I'm at the stage of my career where I've spent many years in the laboratory, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to take insights that we've gleaned from the basic research and really bring them out into the world. And I regard myself now in, I think, many ways similar to a climate scientist, where a climate scientist believes, the data are sufficiently compelling that there's a moral obligation to act. It
Yeah,
doesn't diminish their rigor as a scientist, but they also feel compelled to be an activist. And in the same way, I find myself called to be an activist scientist. So, I'm still unswervingly committed to rigorous science. And at the same time, I also have a moral calling because I believe what the data is telling us, and that is, put simply, that well-being is a skill. It actually can be learned. And if we really believe that, I mean, then I feel like we have a moral obligation to act because the world is falling apart.
yeah,
And humanity is gravely suffering in so many ways. And there are such really devastating indicators of that today. And so one of the reasons we launched this app, not that I think an app is going to do it, but we're trying to figure out ways of scaling well-being. And so we're working with different sectors to do this. One of them is educators.
Yeah.
We have some recent data not yet published, but these data are going to really make headlines because we show in a very large sample randomized controlled trial that when we train teachers to improve their well-being, it significantly increases the students that they teach academic performance and their standardized test scores. And
That,
this is a randomized controlled trial. So
that's fantastic. I think what you're doing, you just said, makes a lot of sense because we're at a critical time, particularly for the younger generations, right? With a big increase in poor mental health and a lot of these kids are very pessimistic. And
exactly.
and so your efforts to do something on a society-wide basis are should to be applauded, and we need more people like you in among scientists.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, Richie. I hope you have a good rest of the summer. It was very nice to talk to you. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Great to talk to you, and thank you for all you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.